I apologize if there's some background music. I'm actually at a hotel in the northeast of Brazil right now. I came to make learning visible, let's say, for some schools here in the area. And it was really, something that I've been discussing with my postgraduate students and other teachers for a while. So I really want to thank the opportunity to do this for gallery teachers once again, because I feel this is such a relevant topic, isn't it? It's something that we don't really talk so much about in ELT, I think. At least I haven't seen it being discussed widely, right? But it is something that we talk about a lot when it comes to research in education, especially after John Hattie published his book, right?
Yeah. That was going to be my first question, André, if I can. I mean, having discussed this with you previously, I think we're both absolutely convinced that this needs to be the next big thing in English language teaching. So a question in two parts. Certainly here in the UK, I think it's not really discussed at all. And I would be really interested, perhaps in the comment section, if colleagues can kind of reflect on how important is this in the training of teachers in the many countries from which our colleagues are coming today. So why hasn't it really hit English language teaching as we would like it to? And apart from sessions like this, what simple advice would you give to a teacher who is new to visible thinking and visible learning so that they can really make it work for their learners?
Excellent. Well, Neil, I really think it's something that is making its way into a ELT nowadays, because we've been attending conferences and talking about the possibility of collecting evidence from our teaching experiences and what our learners are able to produce. But really, I think ELT is very hierarchical in a way, has been for many years. And we're still stuck in certain approaches and methodologies, I think, because this is the way we've been doing things for decades, So if you think about things that were quite popular from the 70s and 80s, they're still being used, very often, I'd say, in big language centers around the world, because, and again, if you go back to the seminal works, the first books published about those approaches and methodologies, nothing has really changed so much in many contexts around the world. So I feel that's the thing is really how stubborn ELT can be sometimes. We have to look beyond and innovate and incorporate some other approaches, right? But also, one of the things I'd say, if you want to get started with visible learning and visible thinking, I'd highly recommend you check out Project Zero. So you go to Harvard's website, you look at how they envisioned things, how everything got started. Nearly, I think, more than 50 years ago, really. Neil Goodman, if I'm not mistaken, was the one who started the project. And then, of course, Howard Gardner was involved for many years. And if you look at what they were trying to do, really, they were trying to have what I called an empirical approach to teaching. Because as it turns out, our senses are not very reliable. So when we just, think of what might be happening in our students' brains, in their minds, we're not really assessing what is happening. So we have to conduct experiments, or we have to actually see the result or the product of what they are doing, they're thinking about, and they're learning. And this is really a change of mindset, I think. So you go to Harvard, go to the website, take a look at all of the evidence they have collected, look at the amazing resources they make available, and try to incorporate those things little by little. You don't have to make a leap or faith, let's say. It's based on evidence. It's really all documented there. There are lots of things you can do. And for you, as a teacher who's never heard of any of this, really, I think it's really easy to implement. It's, you can see the step by step, and you can really transform the way you think of learning and teaching overall, I'd say.
I mean, I think that's what came across so well in the masterclass, that, you know, for people who may be working, you referred to ELT being a bit sort of stubborn, and you also referred in the masterclass to PPP. And I think, you know, what was really nice was we saw some very clear examples of how even in a PPP lesson, we can incorporate visible thinking routines just to kind of move it on. So, you know, when I started, I did my first training in the early 90s, and I was always puzzled that you'd have this group of students, and I'm sure many people watching in today experience this day in, day out. You teach the students something, and you ask them to do a gap fill, and they all seem to do reasonably well. Yep. And the next day, it's as if they have never seen it before.
Precisely,
so
yes.
How can we use visible thinking and visible learning to kind of make the experience of what we teach stickier for our learners? Because that's so important for motivation, isn't it?
Definitely. That's a wonderful question, Neil. And I feel that we normally think of our lesson as a rigid unit, a chunk of the curriculum that once you've done it, it's done, right? And then you don't have to go back to it. And even if you think of ELT materials and how they normally work, the layout, and, you know, how many times you revisit certain things, it just doesn't follow, let's say, a sequence that is based on the evidence that we have on how our memory works, for example. So I think that, for example, we normally try to present things as quickly as possible so that we have more time for practice to take place in the classroom. And then we have even more time possibly for production so that students can interact with one another. But then that doesn't make a lot of sense if you don't revisit those things with a certain frequency, because that's how the brain consolidates memory. So if you made a lot of room or space, you know, or time for your students to practice during that lesson, that's great. And that worked 50 years ago because maybe that was the only point of contact that they had with English language and their tutors, their teachers. But nowadays, it doesn't work so well because, you know, they see English everywhere nowadays. I mean, most students that we teach, they are in touch with the English language. And it doesn't work very well because they need to space out their studies. They have to go back to certain things with a certain frequency so that they can consolidate memory. So what does that tell us then? It tells us that we have to use things like spaced repetition, for example, or retrieval practice. We have to be able to ask our students to remember as much as possible about their last, or even, you know, their last lesson, or maybe a lesson that took place 2 months ago, so that they can revisit those things with the frequency that is required for their brains to consolidate that memory. So that means we have to step back a little bit and away from the PPP framework. Sometimes we can still, you know, pretty much use that layout, but I think we have to bear in mind that it doesn't end in that lesson. It has to be continuous. You have to make sure that they're still on task. That's why feedback is really important, but throughout a longer period. Otherwise, it doesn't, you know, I think I love the word you use, sticky, right? So you want it to be stickier. So you want for it to be stickier, it has to take longer. It has to happen throughout a longer period. Otherwise, we know from cognitive psychology that we forget things very easily. If we don't attend to those things again and again and again until we consolidate them, they're gone, right? So we have to make sure that that's part of our lesson planning and delivery, right?
I mean, back in the later 80s, early 90s, there was Ellis and Sinclair here in the UK who published Learning to Learn, which was this lovely, but it feels very outdated, but actually I think it's about to have its moment again. And one of the things they talked about was, and they got students, they drew a graph showing how that if you repeat vocabulary, the retention of the vocabulary that you learn can go from something like 20% to 80%, simply if you attend to it by allowing students to revisit it. So I think a lot of teachers are quite comfortable with the idea of 5-10 minutes at the beginning of the lesson with a vocabulary box, and the students can choose the words they want to review, and they work in pairs. And, I think it can work online as well in terms of just giving students a couple of minutes to say, go into the rooms, choose the vocabulary you want to review together, and give them some frameworks for how to do it.
Perfect.
But I know a lot of the teachers I've met over the years, they're great with that. But when it comes to grammar or exam skills, how to do an IELTS reading, what advice can you give in terms of making the grammar points and the exam techniques points stickier?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there is a difference between learning vocabulary and learning grammar structures and skills, because there are different types of memory actually in the brain. And the first has to do with what we call conceptual memory or declarative memory. It's the memory that you can verbalize. So their memories, this memory system works for concepts, right? For ideas, notions, descriptions of things. And this, according to cognitive psychology, this is really consolidated during our sleep. So it makes sense for you to go back to those things after a couple of days and revisit them. But for grammar, what probably works best is something that Robert Bjork calls interleaving. That's habitual memory or procedural memory stored in different areas of the brain. It has to do with the cerebellum, for example. And it's really kind of very similar to playing a sport, for example. So if you want to work, I remember when we had this conversation, I told Neil that Robert Bjork had tested tennis players and actually people who had never played tennis in their life, but they wanted to work on their forehand and on their backhand. And that's very similar to, let's say, working on a grammar structure and on a skill, let's say, listening skill or something like that. One of the things that we know that actually might work really well is interleaving. So instead of blocking, which is what we normally do, so we're going to study as much as we can of skill A until we get exhausted, and then we move on to skill B, right? So grammar and listening. Blocking works better. So you set up blocks to study the first skill, let's say 25 minutes, then you have a 5-minute break. So here I'm using the Pomodoro technique as an example. And then you go back, you actually move on to the next skill for 25 minutes, you have another break, and then you go back to the first one. So you're interleaving. So maybe you can study, self-study now, right? As a student at home. Study 25 minutes of listening. So improve your listening skills, take a 5-minute break, and then work on the grammar. So this seems to work really well for procedural memory. And there's a reason. I think the brain likes to have different points of reference, and the effort that you have to make to go back to the first skill when you're doing the second one, for example, strengthens an executive function that we call cognitive flexibility or switching. So it's really mental workout, it's brain workout. It's really like when you go to the gym and you have different series of different workout exercises, and that works really well. If you interleave, you can actually do it for a longer time, and you are making sure that you don't get injured, for example. Now, if you did the same series of the same workout activity for a very long time without interleaving, you would not develop your muscles as much, and you would probably get injured, and you would probably give up very easily, right? So this is so we have to follow those principles of cognitive sciences, definitely.
I'm mindful that as we were going through in the early stages of your masterclass, one of the questions that Gabby raised was this difference between visible thinking and visible learning. Could you maybe come back to that and just explain to us in a little more detail just what the differences are?
Definitely. So like I said, I think visible thinking really precedes visible learning, and visible learning is the end goal of the whole process, basically, right? And learning it's a complex phenomenon. Thinking is also complex, but it's really part of learning. And visible thinking is about making sure that your students are attending to the tasks, because you cannot really learn well if you're not thinking about things. You require some thinking processes or cognitive processes to learn, such as attention and memory. If there's no attention, you don't make new memories. If you don't make new memories, there's nothing to retrieve, then you haven't really learned, right? So how do we make sure that our students are thinking? So we use the visible thinking routines because they're really step-by-step processes that can be quite easily implemented, and we can teach our students, and after a while it becomes a habit and they start applying those things. But that's stage one, right? And then we want them to get to the end of that whole process, to the so they have to go through different stages for them to actually make learning concrete in their brains and consolidate those memories, and not just consolidate those memories, but also be able to retrieve them easily later on when they have to, because that's what learning is about. If you have something in your brain, but you cannot retrieve that, then you haven't really learned. Maybe you're having some difficulty with familiarity. So there might be some processes there that are not happening as they should. So visible learning involves a lot more, really. It involves not just thinking, but being able to reflect upon learning. And I think John Dewey used to say that learning requires reflecting upon experience. It's not just having an experience, but really reflecting on the experience as well. And being able to share that and use that on demand whenever you need it, so that you have that in your brain and you can access those things. And really, it's the culmination, let's say, of all of this thinking processes after you've started using them. And that's what learning is. And that means that for you to, and Gabi asked, can we see learning without thinking? Yes, maybe we cannot see that our students are doing the thinking part now. Maybe we missed that, or it was not too visible or evident. But then we can see learning. We can actually assess learning on the other end, let's say, of the process, and they will give us evidence that they have learned, and but they did think. That's the thing, because it has to precede learning, even though we were not able to measure or to see thinking taking place. They did think, because you cannot really learn without doing those things, right? So one depends on the other. Yeah.
I think as teachers, we need to be very mindful that the way in which our learners are thinking may be radically different from what we expect. And I mean, I remember it was a really salutary lesson. I was working with this incredibly gifted Russian learner and preparing him for one of the most bizarre exams I've ever come across, GMAT, which is used for entry into MBA schools a lot in America. And we were looking at the verbal reasoning part of this GMAT test. We were talking through something, and my learner, I mean, this was the guy who did a PhD in MBA at the same time, in record time. Just at one point, he just glazed over. He was chewing some gum and looking out of the window. He just switched, or I thought had just switched off. So after about 2 or 3 minutes, it felt like a lifetime. It was like, Sergey, if you don't mind me asking, are you okay here? Are you unhappy? Do you need another teacher? Yeah. And he was like, oh, no. I was just thinking that what you've just said is really interesting. And I'm just processing it. And when I process stuff, I look out of the window.
Yeah, look at that.
And I was just like, he wasn't bored. And, I think that was really kind of like, okay.
That's a great example.
Yeah. And so I think really what I missed at that point, and this was probably more than 15 years ago, was to actually go back to him and say, great, okay, so do you want to draw what you've just learned? Do you want to make a mind map of what you've just learned, or just dump everything on a piece of paper? And this brings me on to the next question, because of course, as teachers, and I think it was Sylvie was asking about the value of feedback. And my problem with feedback is that as teachers, we often see it as something we need to validate what we've done. But I actually think much more importantly is when we harness it to validate for the learner, by the learner, where they are at, or to make it clearer, the development of metacognitive skills, so that a student is really understanding, what have I learned? What's not quite so clear? What did I really not learn at all? And how do I then, working with my teacher, attend to that and address it? You mentioned reflection, you mentioned self and peer assessment. Can you maybe just kind of help us to open our eyes on this whole world of getting the student to attend to their own learning?
That's wonderful. Yes. And I feel that I have a good analogy for English teachers who have worked with interactive whiteboards. I'm not sure everyone is familiar with interactive whiteboards, but I remember working at a very large language center in Brazil, and we always had to calibrate to use the pen, the magnetic pen. Do you remember that? So every time so, and this is really related to feedback and learning how to learn. So you calibrate the pen, which means that, so there's a feature somewhere, there's a drop-down menu or something, settings, and then you have to touch certain points of the interactive whiteboard. So it's calibrated. And if it's not calibrated, you will see that there is a huge difference between where you touch the pen and where the line comes out, right? And you have to do it, well, not every week, but you have to do it maybe every month or a couple of months, every 2 months or so, because different people will use the board. And this is really something that related to the idea of control strategies that is within the umbrella of metacognition. So if you think about metacognition, you need to have metacognitive knowledge. You need to have metacognitive experiences that will lead you to your learning outcome. But you also have, and this is the third element, but possibly the most important, control strategies. And control strategies are basically a way for you to know if the pen is calibrated, because you need to have a reference. You need to be able to see where you are and where you're going, right? And there are so many different forms of feedback and sources of feedback, because it can come, like Neil mentioned, from your tutor, from your teacher, from your peer, and from yourself. And I think one way for you to use it for yourself and from yourself has to do with basically documenting what you're able to do and having possibly even rubrics, of the teacher will set some criteria of how you can be assessed against those criteria. And you have to be able to realize if you are very close to that, very far from that, on that, and you have to make adjustments. And this is really being self-regulated and metacognitive. How can I adjust so that I can reach this objective and I can achieve this goal, right? It's not easy. I think as teachers, we probably know, working on our CPD, right, that how do you know where do you want to get to, where do you want to go, which aspects or features of English language teaching do you want to improve about your practice as a teacher? So how do you select that? Well, for me, I have a journal. I have a notebook that I take notes of things that I have attended. I post a lot of things on social media with hashtags. So, and then of course, I use my memory a lot, but I know that I've talked about this. I've attended this session. I have done this. This is the course I did last summer. So now I want to work on this aspect. And really, it's keeping track of your learning process. And that's why you have to make learning visible. And Gabi asked that, right? Do the students have to see their learning? If they don't have a document or a place to go to see how much they have learned, how far they have come, how will they know where to go next, right? How do I select which sessions I will attend next when I go to TEFL, for example, if I don't know exactly which ones I have attended before and the ones that I'm very confident with, right? So you have to make it visible. You have to. Our memory really sucks. I'm sorry to tell you that, So if you don't write down things, or if you keep a portfolio or a journal or anything, you might as well forget. And then you don't know exactly where you have to go, right?
I'm mindful that there is a really interesting question, which I think is absolutely ideal for you, André, given your background in teaching in bilingual education. But we've got a question from Bartolo, who's talking about his experiences of bilingual teaching, or rather teaching where, from what Actually, Bartolo, rather than me trying to synthesize what you've written, do you want to come on and put your mic on and just explain the question to us?
Yes, that would be great.
Hello, Neil. Hello, André.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
We can hear you.
Hello. So, very complicated. So, I really hoped that Neil could translate my thoughts because it's the first time that I'm putting them on writing. But I noticed that I speak several languages. I'm Italian native speaker. I speak Spanish, English, and something else. And I noticed that when I have to translate for someone, especially when there's some pressure on me, I tend to forget the language that I'm speaking. So if there are two people not speaking the same language, and I start to translate, at a certain point, I speak English with the Spanish and Spanish with the English, for example. Yeah. And for me, that means that the listening part and the speaking part are situated in two different parts of our brain. And yeah. I'm wondering if we could use this peculiarity as our advantage. For example, I noticed that when I was with some Italian students, I spoke English with them and I allowed them to speak Italian with me. And at a certain point, especially when I started putting some pressure, some positive pressure on them, they started mirroring me. So even if I didn't ask them to speak English with me, they started speaking English. For example, when we were playing football and I was playing the referee, I started putting pressure on them, rooting for them and screaming. And at a certain point, out of the blue, I asked them what was the score, and they replied in English, not in Italian. Okay. And they started not noticing that they. So we broke the wall of I don't speak English because their brain was distracted. It wasn't now I have to speak English. It was just a mess, and out of this mess we could bring something good out. So
yeah. That's an interesting question, Bartolo. And I can tell you now, yes, there are different areas in the brain responsible for speaking and listening and listen comprehension, definitely. But I also have to tell you that many areas are interconnected with many other different areas. So I'll give you an example. We have a region in the brain called the temporal lobe. So the left temporal lobe has to do with speech processing and understanding language. And we have something that is in our temporal lobe very well. I'm trying to find it here, and it's called Broca's area. So this has to do with speech construction, speech recognition, also, really the articulation of speaking. But then close to your occipital lobe in the back of your brain, we have an area called Wernicke's area that has to do with understanding, like speech comprehension. So it's not really articulation, but it's really comprehension. And when you speak and when you listen, you are using different cortices, right, in your brain, like the auditory cortex to understand speech, to pick up the sounds, let's say, from the environment, process them and everything. And but still, I think the idea here is the type of motivation that you used with your students, I think. Because, you were rooting for your students, you were encouraging them to speak English. And if you're doing that in a negative way, in a way that you are maybe intimidating them, you are making them scared of making mistakes, or they don't want to expose themselves because it's not a welcoming environment, what happens is that our working memory gets full very quickly, and then we just fall back to what is more natural or automatic in the brain. So if you're learning a second language, an additional language, and you have your native language in place, right? What is easier? It's easier for you to just go back to your first language when you are intimidated, scared, afraid of being exposed, and those things are very natural. So that's why I think we have to use a translanguaging approach in that case, which is a code switching, really. It's, whenever they can say what they want to say in English, then they do it. But if they can't, it's okay to fall back onto their native language because they want to communicate anyway, right? And then communicating is really the goal here so that they can have a meaningful interaction. But yes, there is let's say, an obstacle there, right? And I think it's really about our mental state, the type of motivation that we have. And then, of course, little by little, we can break the walls and we can start communicating in the additional language more fluently, right?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Sorry, Bartol, after you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, always positive. Always positive. Yes, definitely.
Yes, positive motivation is better. Yes.
This is really the point where, we're getting this very exciting time where our understanding of neuroscience is really pushing forward our understanding of that kind of interface between a knowledge of neuroscience, second language acquisition, and what happens in the classroom. So I think, you mentioned translanguaging. I remember when Jennifer Jenkins at the University of Southampton was talking about higher education contexts and her idea of English as a lingua franca 3, which is where she'd moved away from talking about pronunciation and the lingua franca core, and she got to the point where she was thinking more at a policy and polity level of, that we use whatever resource we had available to us. And I think I made the mistake at the time of thinking, how does this work? I mean, what, am I supposed to have all my students speaking their own languages in the classroom? That's just ridiculous. But actually, mediation allows for us to sort of navigate that. So the learner who is struggling can have their message potentially in their first language mediated, summarized, made clearer by another learner. And then perhaps what you then do is you work with the first learner and you say, well, now see if you can actually put that into your own words. So I think, the translanguaging movement and the use of translation, or the judicious use of code switching and translation in the classroom, is actually a really exciting point.
Most definitely.
I think also, Bartolo, the other interesting thing here, and I'm no expert here, is what happens where you've got L1, L2, and the other L2, because there are suggestions that the storage of L1 and L2 happens in different places, but also that when you are working with someone in an environment where they're learning L3, their L2 will be dominant rather than their L1, which is a really interesting thing, which I think neuroscience will help us with.
Definitely. I can tell you right now, Neil, that there are lots of studies nowadays, meta-analyses actually. Jubin and Mutalebi at the Università San Raffaele, I think, in Italy. There's Edna Andrews, Duke University in the United States. Ellen Bialystok in Canada, I think. Yeah. And we know that as you're getting more and more proficient in L2, the neurobasis for L1 and L2 is actually quite the same, very similar, which indicates something amazing, that you're always more proficient in your native language than the second language, but you can get very close actually, depending on time and quality of exposure. And you're using the same foundation or in your brain, because you're really activating the same areas that are important for language processing and understanding. So left hemisphere, left temporal lobe, and then some, of course, also your right temporal lobe for intonation and other things, other features of language. But still, it's very interesting that some of the early studies showed very different locations in the brain for you when you're using L1 or L2, because the level of proficiency of L1 and L2 were very different, right? So then it makes sense for you to see very different locations in the brain being activated in fMRI studies, right? But then as you get more and more and more proficient, then they kind of overlap a lot. And that means that literacy in L1 strengthens literacy in L2 and vice versa. Yeah,
right.
And vice versa. Yes.
I'm mindful we've had a couple of really interesting questions come in. Mike has volunteered quite a lot of interesting information about e-portfolios, which I think are a really interesting way of making visible learning. And also, we've got a very interesting question from Anna about the use of student tests as a way of making learning visible. Are you happy to have a look? So Anna's question was, could an evidence of visible learning be giving students tests to correct? She went on to say by that, she meant tests or exercises made by other students, and students then correct them as if they were the teacher. So, rather than, if I've understood you correctly, Anna, and, do come on if you put your microphone off if you're happy to do so, rather than the teacher providing a gap fill activity, whatever, the set of students writes that activity and then gives it to another group of students to complete. So I guess there, the visible learning is actually in the ability of the first group of learners to write the questions that identify they've understood what it is that they are learning. What do you think? How does that work in terms of a way of identifying or showing visible learning taking place?
Yeah, that's interesting. I've done this a couple of times, actually. I've had students make tests for other students. So that shows that they know how to, which topics we discussed and how they would actually formulate a question to ask about those topics, which is a different skill. If you think about it, it's a higher order skill that requires them to have the foundations set in their brain. And if you don't even have the foundational knowledge there, you wouldn't be able to make a test, right? So I think this is a very interesting way to get students to make their learning visible through making tests and also correcting each other's tests, really. Because if you think about it, they normally, one of the things that happens quite often when we give our students their test grades back is they take a look at the number and then that's it. And they don't do anything with it. They don't really engage with what, the correction. Sometimes they do want to learn from the correction that we made. But I think when they have to make an effort to try to analyze based on their prior knowledge, what their peers were able to deliver in terms of their, answers and everything, that actually helps them activate certain areas of their brain that are related to higher order thinking again, the prefrontal cortex, for example. And that means that they will have to use different skills and different neural networks to be able to do that, thus strengthening those networks that they already have. And that's I think it's something that you should try. But the thing, again, Anna, maybe we shouldn't be giving them lots of tests like that, not like high stakes tests, I think, because that beats the purpose in a way. I think you can use tests as a way to get them to assess where they are and where they're going, low stakes tests, and really, and I'm sure Neil is going to talk about that in his workshop as well, assessment as learning rather than assessment of performance, like I said. And that's what tests normally do, right? So you look back and you look at what students were able to remember till that day. And it's very likely that they will have forgotten most of it by tomorrow because they really studied hard to pass the test, right? The night before. So maybe if you apply the same test a week later, they would get what, 30%, 50%? And again, so maybe we should avoid using high stakes tests all the time. And again, work with tests as pop quizzes, Kahoot, for example, Mentimeter, and all of those wonderful tools we can use to help them learn. So as learning in the process of learning and not really to assess if they have remembered the things we expose them to, right?
Laura has made a really interesting point about the fact that she only has 3 hours a week with her students. And it's kind of, well, how on earth do I fit all of this in? And I feel for you, Laura, because I've had classes recently where I saw students 2 hours a week. So yeah, you kind of think, well, heck, how can I do all of this really important work with spaced repetition? How can I work with brain dumps? when am I actually ever going to be doing any teaching? I don't know about you, André, but my kind of light bulb moment was the day when I actually sat down and thought, well, if I keep on just teaching, the fact of the matter is, if I see them 3 hours a week, 2 weeks' time, everything that I did 2 weeks ago is lost anyway. So if I actually invest in teaching, no, let me rephrase that. If I invest in a classroom where there is deep learning taking place, then at that point, I've actually got to win anyway. I suppose then you've got the issues around how can you encourage learners and how do you incorporate visible thinking and visible learning where perhaps you're using something like a flipped classroom so that you're making use of the students' asynchronous as well as their in-class time in order to kind of get that, basically make your 3 hours go longer and last longer.
Definitely.
How can we do that?
That's a very important question because we don't have enough time with our students. In most traditional language institutes here in Brazil, you'll have maybe 3 hours a week, like you said, maybe 4 hours or 3 hours and a half a week. And I think nowadays the pandemic has shown us that we haven't been using a lot of tools that can make our lives easier, such as a learning management system, for example. A virtual learning environment with all of the resources that we can have. And I'll give you one example, Google Classroom, which is free. It's very easy to set up. And I feel like so there's a stream, a wall, and then you have a tab for classwork, and then a tab for grades, it could be any LMS really. It doesn't matter which one you're using, but you can schedule things to pop up when you feel that your students haven't seen them for a very long time, working with spaced repetition, for example. You can also make sure that, just like Neil said, you can pre-record some videos, instructional videos that the students have to watch, maybe, 10 minutes before your synchronous lesson to get the instruction. And then when they come to the lesson, they're going to apply their knowledge, let's say, right? So, and this is really in line with the idea of flipped classroom, right? They are going, when they get together, when they have actual human beings to interact with, that's when they should be using their knowledge and applying the things that they have learned so that they can really consolidate those things in their brains. But in terms of receiving instructions and reading something or watching something or listening to something, I'm sure they can do all of those things before the lesson, as long as you make something available. Like I normally have tutorials, video tutorials that I can record them in 5 minutes, really. And I just tell my students, so for today's lesson, before you join the link, you have to watch this video and you have to access this and you have to read this and then you have to add a comment to the stream of Google Classroom or a Padlet or a Jamboard, just to make sure, again, because if I just tell them to do it, but they didn't make it visible for me, how will I know if they actually did it, right? So I asked them to always show the evidence. So did you do it? Did you watch the video? Did you post a comment? Did you add something to our Jamboard, right? And then when they come to the lesson, it's like we did the presentation step already, right? So we just skipped that because they did that from the video. Now we do have more time for practice and production, but all other things as well, retrieving things about other classes, right? That they learned maybe 5 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. So we can do that. And I think really use technology to help you. Use learning management systems. Use class journals. I love physical class journals if you're working with in-person students. So every day, every lesson, somebody's going to take the journal with them, write what they did, their impressions, summarize the lesson, bring back, and then somebody else will take the journal with them. This is a wonderful way to actually even build a sense of community. Remember that John Hattie talks about student-teacher relationships, right? So if you think about it, and they add, pictures of their family, anything really, and it becomes a journal about that group, that you have this identity that was, part of really doing that activity. I think they feel like they are part of this learning community and they want to learn more, I guess.
I was really struck, if we continue with this word visible, you've talked just now about the online environment. And I think for many people, online will decrease, the emergency remote teaching. And a lot of people are just really looking forward to getting back into the classroom. I can't let this session end without you talking about your sticky notes and your different colors in a physical book to really help to do that spaced repetition in such a simple and easy way.
Yes. So this really came to me after I realized that, I had a session with John Hughes, I think, and he was talking about 3 different types of teachers: the ones who really stick to the book, the ones who use the book as a reference, and the ones who just look at, what topic do I have to cover, really? And then they use other resources, right? And I remember that I've always believed that we can find more interesting resources from the book. We can use the book as a reference, as a guide, and we find them on YouTube, for example, or website. They're really doing the same thing that the book is asking us to do, but in a more engaging way. So that means that I would normally wrap up the lesson with a lot of activities that I didn't do with my students, right? So they were just there. I skipped those activities, and parents were very angry at me at the time because they thought that they had paid a lot of money and I'm not using the book. And, and I said, well, there are other things that we can use. But then I came up with this idea of recycling those activities. So we can use them later on throughout the course in a way that the students are actually doing spaced repetition. So I needed to create a system for the students to know which activities we hadn't done and when they were supposed to revisit those activities. And I have a couple of stickers, those colored stickers that you normally use like as bookmarkers or something like that, or sticky notes or Post-its, whatever you have that makes sense. And I use the color system that basically goes like this. If it's green, that means you have to retrieve the next day after that lesson, because it's no, actually the other way around. If it's red, it's urgent, so you have to do it the next day. If it's yellow, then you can do it the next week or so. If it's green, then you can do it a month after or many weeks after. And normally what we do very simply is I tell my students, okay, this activity is just like the next one, and we watch the video, so we're going to save this one for retrieval later on, okay? And then they get the stickers, and then they put the 3 stickers there sometimes, or just one, depending on how confident they are. If they feel like, I don't know this, they put the red sticker. If they feel like, yeah, I got this, they put the yellow sticker, for example. But normally I ask them to put the 3 stickers there, because then when they come to the next class, I will have maybe 3 minutes or so, and I will ask them to go back to the stickers so they can actually find the pages. And then they try to retrieve those things, right? So basically they look at the exercise and what the exercise is asking them to do, and then they close the book. They just have to remember what was the topic. And then they try to write down everything they can remember about that topic. And then they go, or I ask them not to write in their books, not to fill in the gaps, because you know what? They will have to solve to actually answer as they go back to those activities. And I've noticed that they are better able to retrieve those things now, because we save time of basically every lesson for them to go back to those activities, recycling activities, and they retrieve. And then the fun thing about this is that many times students can select different activities, because maybe I skipped 2 of them, and then it's going to be differentiated as well, because they are going to select the activities that make more sense, because they feel that they're not very confident about those activities. And it's something I wrote about on my blog, and then you can take a look. You can actually create a whole monthly schedule to make sure you're using the stickers right. And I think it works really well. And you don't need technology to do that, just sticky notes.
Inevitably, with just so much we could have talked about this afternoon, we've not been able to even kind of cover everything that our colleagues who are watching have talked about, and I'm mindful that we are pretty much out of time. And we've not had the opportunity to talk about e-portfolios. Mike, can I just perhaps suggest here that, as André has already hinted at, there is a session that's taking place on the 22nd of July, where if you've enjoyed this afternoon, and André, it's been such a pleasure learning from you. Thank you. We're turning the tables. I'm going to be doing a session on assessment with André as the panelist on the afternoon of the 22nd of July. One of the things that comes up in there is e-portfolios. So Mike, if you're able to join us, I'd love you to be able to talk a little bit more about how you're using them. And any of you who are interested in how the portfolio can really help make learning visible, and because it asks the student to make decisions about what they're going to include. So there's a degree of reflection built in. And then if you make that visible, why did you decide to include this? Why did you not decide to include that? That actually that's again is another way of actually developing the metacognitive skills and making it visible all at the same time. So I think we've got a bit of a partnership going here, André, but what a great session. Thank you so much.
Definitely.